Good morning, friends, and welcome back to the conversation. What we're going to do here today is, this segment is we're going to talk with Rand Paul, Senator Paul that's joined us. He's a senator from Kentucky. Welcome back aboard, sir.
Glad to be here. We just came down through the windy skies and landed in Des Moines, and my kids were asking, my youngest son looked at me and said, "Dad, are we crash landing?" And I said, "I hope not."
Well, you were in a small jet, right? A
small plane, King Air, coming in, and it
was a turbo or a turboprop, or is it?
I'm not sure which one. It was 2 engines, 2 pilots, and really windy.
Did it have propellers?
It did have propellers. Okay. It was a plane. Yeah, I knew it was a plane. It wasn't a jet.
Okay, got it. All right. So welcome to Iowa. You've been here many times, and you're now. I'm assuming you're here to campaign on behalf of your father, unless you're going to shock us with some.
Yes, I've got some news this morning. I am here to endorse Ron Paul.
What kind of this is an Oprah question, and I don't mean to start this way, but I'm going to anyway. What kind of a dad was he? Because he's been an activist all of his life. He was a physician. He was a military surgeon. I think it was in the Air Force, right?
Yes, he was a medical officer in the Air Force. And I guess as a dad, we grew up in a small town. What I always loved about my town is you could ride your bike everywhere. We rode our bikes to swimming practice, to baseball practice. He was a physician who worked very hard. OBGYNs are up all night delivering babies. He was well respected. Everybody in the community knew him as someone who cared and had delivered their babies. He came to our athletic events, our sporting events.
What were you good at?
I was pretty good at a lot of things, but not really good at anything.
You did baseball and swimming, it sounds like.
I did baseball and swimming, a little bit of football when I grew up. I didn't quite have the stature for football, but I was scrappy and would play. Played golf, played a lot of sports.
You shortstop?
Infield a lot, second, short.
Okay, because you look like you'd be quick.
I was pretty fast and could hit pretty well.
So if you had been a kid now, you would have been recruited for soccer because you were built for soccer.
Yeah, and my kids all play soccer, and soccer I think would have been my sport. But where I grew up in Texas, we didn't have soccer, and soccer now has come on, but we didn't have it back then.
That's because the cattle ate all the grass.
That could be too.
So, and you became a physician.
Yes, I'm an ophthalmologist. I do eye surgery and have really enjoyed it. And that's one of the things I miss about being in the Senate is their rules prevent me from practicing.
Why?
They say I can practice. I just can't charge anyone. But that shows you how out of touch they are with business because you have to pay your malpractice insurance. You got to pay the nurses. You got to pay your staff. And so they say, well, yeah, you can do it. You just have to do it for free. And so I do some charity surgery at different places around the state because I know a lot of the ophthalmologists around Kentucky, and I enjoy doing it, and I want to stay in practice because I want to go to Washington and not be afraid to be unelected. I always said I'm going to go up there and do what I think needs to be done, and if they send me back home, I've got a good job waiting for me, but as a consequence, I need to stay in practice so I don't lose my skills.
So when you say surgeon, was it mainly now like cataract surgery and glaucoma surgery and maybe even the new LASIK stuff?
Yeah, I did the LASIK surgery as well, but primarily I'd say the most common surgery I did was cataract surgery. Cataracts are incredibly common. After age 70, probably 30 or 40% of people have cataracts and will eventually have surgery.
Do you think that's diet related? Do you think that's a function of what we don't or do have somewhere in our system?
A little bit. There was a big nurses study that went on over about a 10 or 15 year period, and they thought that vitamin C might be preventative of cataracts. Sunlight is probably related to cataracts. Sunlight is also probably related to macular degeneration. And one interesting thing about macular degeneration, if you've ever had a parent or a grandparent that has this, you lose your central vision and it's irreplaceable, and you have difficulty reading and a lot of times lose your vision for reading. The interesting thing is it's all Caucasians. African Americans don't get it. So the pigment, the extra pigment in your skin that you see if you're African American is also in your eyes, and it protects you from macular degeneration.
So I like my blue eyes, but it's a big mistake. I should have
wear sunglasses. Wear sunglasses
everywhere.
Yep.
Well, I also noticed there was an altitude difference too. A lot of mountain people, they get above a certain altitude level, and all that's sun related too, isn't it?
Probably sun related, and you also get cosmic radiation more. In Colorado and up in the mountains where the air is thinner, you get more radiation.
So are you in the Senate because of the Tea Party?
Yes. There was a huge movement in 2010, and I went around the state saying, look, it's not good enough to be a Republican. It's important what kind of Republican we nominate. And we had just gone through that banking crisis, and half the Republicans, in fact, the majority of the Republican leadership voted for the bank bailout. And it's kind of why that I've said, and I've gotten a little involved here, I wrote something in the Des Moines Register that talked about Gingrich is that I don't think we want as our nominee someone who supported the two things that the Tea Party was founded to get rid of, Obamacare and the bank bailouts. And Gingrich supported the bank bailouts, and then he also supported the individual mandate, which is the linchpin behind Obamacare. I think we lose our two big issues if we have our nominee already agreeing with the president on these things.
I was reading his endorsement of Romneycare, and the wording on it was it sounded kind of common sense. I kind of bounced this off you. He said, hey, I always think it's a good idea when people support themselves in their own health care needs, implying that if you can require somebody to buy insurance and take care of their own health care needs, they won't be dumped on the rest of us. Is the difference in the Romneycare versus the Obamacare? One is Obama is the national health care is a form of cost shifting, that is income redistribution. The Romneycare was less so, that he just made people go out and, hey, in order to live here, you have to go out and buy your own health insurance. Or was it income redistribution at that level?
I think the idea that when you get sick and you go in and you don't have health insurance, that someone else has to pay for your care.
Right.
Is wrong, and we can all sort of agree that, yeah, you shouldn't have to pay because you have insurance for someone else's care. But then it doesn't follow, therefore, that then the government should mandate that they fix this situation, that the government should mandate that you buy something. And really, the Supreme Court case, I think, is really big that's coming up. It's not just about health care. It's not just about the mandate. It's about whether the Commerce Clause in the Constitution can say to you that the inactivity, you not buying health insurance, is somehow trade. And in fact, the court cases so far have been almost surreal. You've had these liberal judges say that by the thought process of thinking about buying insurance and then deciding not to buy insurance, that somehow is trade.
Well, since that has
interstate trade.
Well, yeah, they said since it has an economic effect, that grants us jurisdiction to regulate, and it's a stretch. But
and I
they've
think
been using that for a long time.
Right, and that's why I hope we go back, and I hope the Supreme Court, and I suspect that Clarence Thomas will do this in his writings because this has been his position, is that I would like to see him go back and overturn Wickard v. Filburn. That was the case back in the 40s where a farmer said, I'm going to grow my own wheat and I'm going to feed it to my cattle. I'm not even going to sell it. What does that have to do with interstate commerce?
Right.
And the court came back and said, by you not selling it, you could indirectly affect the price of interstate wheat. Therefore, we have a right to come in and tell you how much you can grow. This is the only Supreme Court case that Barry Goldwater mentions in Conscience of the Conservative.
Yes.
It really is the tipping point from the Depression to the 40s. It opened the gateway to big government. All of big government is driven through the Commerce Clause, and by expanding the Commerce Clause to mean nothing, we've allowed our government to get away from ourselves, and we've allowed it to get away from enumerated powers and from restraint and from limited government. So that's why the Supreme Court case, if they overturn the mandate and they restrict Wickard v. Filburn, it'll be the biggest victory for limited government and constitutional government in the last 50 years.
So by what you said, you need to go and overturn that Supreme Court case. It allows me to ask a couple more diagnostic questions about your understanding of the role of the courts. I mean, for instance, in your dad's book on liberty, he said, hey, the Supreme Court doesn't make law. You don't need to overturn a bad Supreme Court ruling. You just legislate and say, listen, we disagree with you, and there's nothing in the Constitution that grants the courts any laws or any positions either on the purse, explicitly in one of the Federalist Papers. The courts cannot deal with issues of the purse or of issues of war, excluded by the people who wrote the Constitution. And your dad would have said, well, we don't need to overturn this. We just need to invalidate it through the legislature. The legislature should be standing up and say, you don't have the jurisdiction to do this, and if you do it again, we'll impeach your sorry keisters.
Well, and this is a good point, and George Will writes a lot about this, about how Congress basically has abdicated their role. It's not necessarily that the judiciary or the Supreme Court has taken away power, it's that Congress has simply given it up. Congress doesn't get involved in these issues. Congress has given up on the issue of declaring war. Declaring war was an important power given to Congress, and it was a separation of power. The president executes the war, but Congress should declare the war, but we no longer do it simply because Congress refuses to do it. Congress refuses to step up and assert their power. I'm
going to ask you about what the president just signed, the Defense Appropriation Act, while he's on vacation in Hawaii, signing maybe one of the most important pieces of legislation dealing with both funding the Defense Department and future freedoms. I'm going to take a short time out. We're talking here in the studio with Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. If you'd like to join the conversation, we'll talk about his dad. If there's any questions you have about his dad and you didn't get answered in the last several times we've had a chance to talk with Ron Paul, now is an excellent time to do so. 284-1040 or 800-469-4295 in a moment. Here in the studio with us is Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. What part of Kentucky?
I live in Bowling Green. It's about an hour north of Nashville in the southern part of Kentucky.
Okay, you're talking, by the way, to a Kentucky colonel.
All right.
Martha Lane Collins, after I worked in Cincinnati, made me a Kentucky colonel.
Is that because you were a good Democrat and knew Martha Lane well?
No, I just worked across the river in Cincinnati, and a bunch of my listeners kept pushing her paperwork. I don't think she had a clue who I was, but my listeners did. Do you ever go to the races?
I've been to the Kentucky Derby, and I've also been to the races at Keeneland. I have a son at the University of Kentucky, which is in Lexington, and that's where the Keeneland racetrack is. And we love going and rooting for the horses and, watching our Kentucky thoroughbreds run.
Let's talk to as many people as we can. This is a big deal. I think it was yesterday the president signed into law the National Defense Administration Act or something like that. I think it's called NDAA. You and Senator McCain almost came to, you did come to some pretty tense language, but so you guys really went at each other on the Senate floor over this. Tell us your opinion of this legislation, what your reservations are. Even the president, he issued a signing statement, says, even though I have the power to detain Americans indefinitely, I will never do it.
Right. Well, on a personal basis, Senator McCain and I get along well, and I respect him as a war hero, and I respect his service to our country. I did ask him a question on the floor, though. My question was, if this bill passes, could a U.S. citizen be accused of a crime in the United States and be sent to Guantanamo Bay for indefinite detention without a trial by a jury? And his answer essentially was yes. That concerns me, particularly because the government now puts out bulletins with descriptions of people you need to report that they might be terrorists. This description by the FBI says that people with missing fingers, people with stains on their clothes, people who like to pay in cash, people who buy weatherized ammunition, people who have large...
What's weatherized ammunition?
I think it's for when you hunt. It's the boxes are somehow weatherized to keep the ammunition from getting wet.
To keep your powder dry.
There you go. You go. But the thing is if we're going to say that people are potentially terrorists because they like to pay in cash or because they have large stores of food, one of the things was if you have more than 7 days of food. The irony is there's another government website that says you should have 7 days of food in case there's a natural disaster.
Yes.
And so, but what my concern is that now what they're talking about is people could be arrested for association with terrorism if they meet some of these characteristics, and I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that if you say, I don't agree with what my government's doing and I don't like big government, are you somehow now someone who's a potential terrorist? That concerns me. It also concerns me that we had 800 years of developing jury by trial. It's worked pretty well. It helps to protect the innocent. It gives you a chance to defend yourself. And I think it's an important thing not to give up.
And you're convinced? The president says, yes, I have the power to do that. But he says, I would never do that. And in his signing statement, he committed to never actually using that power.
Well, Madison in one of the Federalist Papers said that if we had a government of angels, we wouldn't have to be concerned about restraining government. If government were always good people, we wouldn't have to worry. The reason we have laws and the reason we have the Constitution is to restrain big government, to restrain government from becoming tyrannical. So I don't think it's enough to rely on the saying, oh, we'll always elect good people. In Germany, once upon a time, they elected Hitler. And, right. That didn't turn out so well. So I think we have to be careful and that the law should restrain government in case we ever do elect somebody that's really terrible.
Also in this legislation, they changed the Uniform Code of Military Justice to remove the part about gays in the military and that kind of behavior in the military. Should they have done that?
I think the way we should control sexual misconduct in the military is to have a policy that's very strict and allows our soldiers to be in close contact in a sense and feel comfortable about that, and that is to have no sexual misconduct. I do think, though, you can write laws that don't refer to what kind of sexual conduct. The military does have different rules. It's against the rules to commit adultery in the military, and yet, that happens in the regular world all the time. But in the military, you can be court-martialed, I believe, still for adultery. You can't have dating between officers and the enlisted. So they do have a special set of rules, and I think they have the right to make special sets of rules. I do think, though, that laws, when either through the military or through the government, can be written in such a sense that they just outlaw all misbehavior, sexual misbehavior, or sexual misconduct.
Well, they repealed the sodomy article. Now that's not labeled as misbehavior. Now it's a protected class. Now it's apparently protected behavior.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand that. I know that there always have been rules against sexual misconduct, and I would just say all sexual misconduct is worthy of either being discharged or court-martialed.
Well, so they've removed that category of sexual misbehavior and now say not only is it not sexual misbehavior, now it's a special class, and the next step is military benefits based upon that what used to be sexual misbehavior.
And if that's true, I would definitely disagree with that. I think there need to be rules of conduct, and the only thing I would do is I wouldn't indicate who it's between. I would just say any sexual misconduct, the military should be allowed to drum you out or court-martial or whatever it takes in order to keep an environment where our soldiers can work together.
But in this case, they've removed that behavior. What last week was sexual misconduct.
Right.
And debased behavior. And as Washington, the very first commander-in-chief drummed people out of the military, literally drummed them out of the military for engaging in sodomy. Now it's protected.
Yeah, that's a mistake.
It's a mistake. That's part of this NDAA. And that also gives the president
I was one of only 7 senators to vote against it, and so I voted against the new bill. Number one, because of the provisions allowing U.S. citizens to be sent to Guantanamo Bay without a jury trial. But also the other reasons you bring up are good reasons as well.
Let's go right back to the conversation. Thank you, friends, for being patient. Rand Paul is here. He represents his dad's presence. I've known your dad a long time, 20 plus years. I interviewed him when he was a congressman. I interviewed him when he was back in medical practice. I think I even got his newsletters as a talk show. I think they just sent them to me because I was on the radio. And I read them but this was before blogs. This is before the internet even existed. Newsletters used to be the internet, used to be the blogosphere. And his investment newsletter and political newsletter was always interesting, was always fiery, and always politically incorrect. That is one of the reasons I liked it so much, because even back then he was not into worrying about the sensitivities of the elites. He just liked blurting out what he considered to be the truth, and he didn't worry about how sensitive the language was. Now, 20 years later, the people are digging out this stuff and implying that he's a racist, that he's a homophobe, that he's anti-Semitic, that he's just a real knuckle dragger. So, how do you respond to this? And I know it's an unfair question, but I'd like you to. What do you think when they're trash talking your dad like this? I was telling you before we got started. Fox News all weekend long was running in their crawls, in case you're wondering what that is, friends. So the little sentences that are running underneath the talking heads that are speaking that moment. Ron Paul is trying to defend his racist newsletters, and they never gave a single example of how it's racist. And all weekend long, they were talking heads saying he's homophobic and he's a bigot. You know, just ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, I think it's unfair. I've known my dad a long time. I probably heard his first political speech that he ever gave. I've heard thousands of his speeches, and I've never heard him once say that we should judge individuals based on anything other than their character. Never on the color of the skin, never on their sexual orientation. In fact, he believes so strongly in a philosophy of individual rights that it is sort of anathema to him to think that we would ever see people based on a collective, meaning that we don't judge people collectively. We don't judge them all because they're all Presbyterians, because they all have a certain sexual habit, or because they're all black, white, or brown. We judge people as individuals. We judge them in a judicial system that way based on what they have either been accused of individually, but it has nothing to do with what group they come from. And I think you'll find no one in Congress or in public life who more strongly believes in individual rights, that no groups get special rights because they're in a group, but also that people are treated as individuals. And so I've been very proud of him all through the years for his position.
Well, that's a reference, I think, obliquely, a reference to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And he was criticized as being against that. The people who wrote the 1964 Civil Rights Act, including Hubert Humphrey, said if this legislation ever it unleashes quotas, I'll eat this legislation. Well, I think he died of that indigestion because that's exactly what it was used for, group entitlement, group hiring practices. It was turned into proportions rather than equality, and he voted against it. And he's been labeled a racist for voting against it.
Well, and I think we've gotten to the point where there's a lot of confusion over property ownership now. We now have confusion over whether or not you can have a cigar bar. We have confusion over whether or not you can have a restaurant and whether or not you have to label your food with how many calories. So there's a lot of confusion over ownership, and I think that's part of the thing that my father's been concerned about.
I'll take a short time out here. We're talking with Senator... Oh, I should ask this question. I asked this once before. Rand, is that refer to Ayn Rand? Because we have a lot of people, this is just another example of this how the conspiracy mentality works. Right. He named his own kid after Ayn Rand. He's an objectivist, and this is just another example of his revealing his political philosophy.
Just an urban myth. And the interesting thing is while I like Ayn Rand, if you say that, people then immediately say, oh, you agree with everything she ever wrote.
Yes.
My father's a fan of hers, but my father's a Christian and believes in God and believes that God has an involvement in our lives. Ayn Rand didn't, or Ayn Rand didn't believe that at all. So to believe that she had some good points about individualism, about limited government, and about capitalism doesn't mean that you believe everything that she ever wrote. But I am a fan and have read all of her books, but I wasn't named after him.
Were you named after anybody particularly? Is Rand short for something?
Just short for Randall.
Is it really?
Mm-hmm.
And he shortened it, or did you?
My wife did.
Really?
Yep. She said you got to get. If I'm going to go out with you, you have to have an older name.
Older name?
Well, I was Randy at the time, and she said that's a kid's name. You got to be Rand, or I'm not going to go out with you. And she was pretty hot, and I wanted to go out with her, so I had to change my name.
People do all kinds of stuff when their hormones kick in. I am so proud of you. A brief time out, back in a moment at 1040 WHO. Senator Rand Paul here in the studio with us. He's proxying for his dad. Tomorrow, by the way, on caucus day, some people just say, well, we're not going to talk about politics in a caucus day in respect for the moment. Well, we don't respect the moment that we're going to politic every single morsel of the time. We'll have proxies. Anybody who will want to campaign on behalf of anybody are welcome to chat with us tomorrow, right down to the last moment. People will be chatting with us. Also, later this morning, Pat Buchanan is going to be on our Newsmaker line talking about his book. And since he's been there and done that here in Iowa, I thought he'd be a very interesting fellow to chat with, especially in this election cycle. Sir, let's talk to as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. And this is Bob. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Jan.
Hi.
Good morning, Senator.
Morning.
I was wondering what you thought about, or if you thought it was appropriate the other night when your dad was on television and he accused Bachmann of hating all Muslims and Santorum of hating gays and Muslims.
Well, it was on a comedy show, and I think he was trying to be lighthearted and funny, because the question that started out that was, what do you think, Romney's would be good at? And he said, he'd make a good governor maybe, and Gingrich would make a good speaker, but not a good president. So I think it started out in a little bit of a lighthearted vein, and I don't think was meant to be exactly a serious or literal statement.
Yeah. Well, I just thought a lot of people took it differently. I mean, it's kind of stirring the fire up a little bit, telling somebody to hate gays and Muslims. And
yeah, I don't think it was probably a completely fair statement to anybody if you were to take it literally as a part of policy. But I know Michelle Bachmann, and I think she has some good attributes. And but I would say that the comment was probably meant to be more in line for a comedic response on a funny show.
The biggest, thank you, Bob, I appreciate it. The biggest impediment to Ron Paul's support here in Iowa, well, I would say I really, really like his economics. He's right on the dollar. He's right on the gold. He's right on the Federal Reserve. He's right on limited government. He's right on the Constitution. He's right on the courts. But he scares the bejeebers out of us on his foreign policy. One of the, in fact, our afternoon fella, Simon Conway, asked him on almost the day after that bin Laden was captured and then executed or shot or whatever, however that resolved itself, would you have sent somebody to do that? He said, well, no. And people don't understand that. People are still trying to process his foreign policy.
I think some of the things on bin Laden is more the process, because, he did vote to go after bin Laden. The authority to use force in Afghanistan was to go after the perpetrators of 9/11. Ron Paul did vote for that. I think he was concerned about the process of doing it. It was done in Pakistan, and whether or not it should be done in conjunction, if possible, with the government, of Pakistan. Now, maybe it wasn't possible. I continue to think, actually, that Pakistan did know that we did it, and I think at some level they did, and they wanted a certain level of deniability, because their fundamentalist Islamic group in Pakistan, I think, is very volatile, and they don't want them to overthrow the government. So I think even if they knew about us coming in, they're saying, we knew nothing about it, because they don't want to be overthrown by their fundamentalist minority.
Related to this, David. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Hi.
Hi. I didn't catch part of what you were just talking about, so I hope I'm not repeating. A lot of things that Representative Paul talks about as far as economics, I think are very good and straight on.
Yes.
His foreign policy, if you can call it a policy, I think is terrible. I think that when he says that he doesn't care whether Iran has an atomic weapon or not.
Yes.
And maybe they need one because everybody else has one. And other, what I would call loony ideas.
All right,
David
has just encapsulated everything I was just talking to you. Thank you, David.
Good. Let me interject here and say that, first of all, I think his views on foreign policy have been misrepresented and not fully understood. He does care if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. He thinks it's a bad idea. He thinks it would destabilize the Middle East. The question, however, though, is you have to decide what to do. You have to decide whether we're going to have preemptive war or whether we might be able to contain Iran should they get a nuclear weapon. He uses the comparison of the Soviet Union. At one point in time, the Soviet Union had 30,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the United States. A terrible situation, but we didn't preemptively attack the Soviet Union because we thought the unintended consequences might be worse than trying to contain them. It may well be the same with Iran, and I'll give you a couple of reasonable people who I think have the same opinion. The three previous heads of the U.S. Central Command, General Abizaid, General Zinni, and General Fallon, all think preemptive strike is a bad idea. Yesterday, the head of the Mossad, Israel's intelligence, Tamir Pardo, came out and said that he thinks that Iran having a nuclear weapon is not an existential threat to Israel, and that if we keep saying that, we're boxing ourselves into a situation where we may have all-out war with Iran. But Ron Paul does not want them to have a nuclear weapon, but the question is, do you want someone who's trigger-happy to be your commander-in-chief, someone who might unleash a nuclear war at the drop of a hat, or do you want someone who is reluctant to go to war, who knows that Congress only can declare war, that we shouldn't fight war under a UN banner, that we should only fight for our own national security, but there should be an open and public debate in Congress? This is what the Constitution says. The President doesn't carry you to war. Congress declares war. That's an important check and balance. And Ron Paul does care about Iran, but he does think that one other option besides preemptive war would be trying to contain them.
When you used the word trigger-happy, did you have anybody in mind?
I'm concerned about a lot of the Republican field in the sense that you want a commander-in-chief who's not careless. You know, you don't want someone who's reckless. You're in charge of an arsenal of, 10, 20,000 nuclear weapons. You want someone who really has the gravitas to say that war is a failure of policy and should not be our first choice. I would say one that springs to mind is, Santorum. I think he's a little overeager to drop bombs. He's also someone who never served in the military. Ron Paul served in the military, will use force against our enemies if required and if Congress approves of it. But I'm a little concerned about someone who didn't serve in the military like Santorum, who's a little overeager to bomb countries, because I don't think he's maturely thinking through the process and the consequences of war.
We'll take our last time out here. You're welcome to join the conversation. Here's how. 284-1040 or 800-469-4295. My in-studio guest, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. He is supporting his dad in the presidential race. Your turn in a moment. Lots of folks have questions for Senator Rand Paul. We're going to be talking with Pat Buchanan coming up shortly. This is Phil. Good morning, Phil.
Hi, Jan. Hi, Senator. How you doing?
Good.
I just want to say I can't wait for the day that Senator Rand Paul runs for office for president. That's the prayer that I have. The thing that I keep hearing kind of ad nauseum is that Ron Paul's foreign policy is so bad. And I'm trying to figure out from all the Christian conservative set and the Republican whatever establishment, how long can we keep spending trillions and trillions of dollars to go all over the world and run these multi-front wars? I mean, where is it in the Constitution that that we have the authority in the president or anybody to go and do that stuff and continue with all this nation building? I just don't see how we can keep going like this.
I'll give you just a quick example of some of the contradictions that are out there. We borrow $40,000 a second. We are borrowing $1.5 trillion a year as a government. We owe China over $1 trillion. We actually give foreign aid to China. Another good question for Mr. Santorum. Why have you been voting for foreign aid for China? And yet when we look at the Straits of Hormuz, which are in the middle of our foreign policy now, the Straits of Hormuz, China gets 50% of their oil through the Straits of Hormuz, and yet for some reason it's the U.S.'s obligation to protect the Straits of Hormuz, and not China has no role and obligation at all. So we spend billions and billions of dollars protecting the entire world. China gets rich off of it. We owe China a ton of money, and then we provide the defense for China to keep the seas open so they can get their oil from Iran.
When you, as a senator, stand there and you listen to the some of these things proposed, Do you ever stand up and say point of order? Where your dad used to do this all the time. You can't do this. Unconstitutional. He used to call him Dr. No for that reason. Are you going to be the next generation, Rand Paul, be the next generation of Dr. No?
We can only hope so. But recently, a couple of things. We stand up and we try to eliminate foreign aid. Foreign aid is, if you ask the American people, 77% of everybody, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, think foreign aid's a bad thing. We're borrowing $40,000 a second, and yet we're sending money overseas to countries. We even send China. We send China economic development aid. Can you believe it? China is growing like gangbusters, and we're sending them aid so they can develop economically.
Wouldn't that be an appropriate time for a filibuster?
You would think so.
Wait a second. I'm asking
you. We have tried, and we have, sometimes you can filibuster things, sometimes it's an amendment. So we added an amendment to several things, but here's the sad thing. Of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate, we got only 20 votes, no Democrats, and only 20 Republicans supported reducing and eliminating foreign aid. I think the last amendment we tried was reducing foreign aid, but that's why when you vote for conservative, you need to be careful. It's not a big government conservative like Santorum, who's been a big promoter of foreign aid.
I'm getting the idea that you think Santorum is now representing a threat.
Well, you're starting to see that some of the conservatives have gone here and there, and they're looking for someone who they think is their champion. But before they settle on somebody like Santorum, they need to realize that he was a big supporter of Medicare Part D, the expansion of Medicare, big supporter of No Child Left Behind. I've seen him ask directly about the Department of Education. He's for it, whereas a lot of us who were big supporters of Ronald Reagan, my dad was one of the original supporters of Ronald Reagan, we still believe in eliminating the Department of Education, that there is no function at the federal level for that. But Rick Santorum's a big promoter of the Department of Education. He, in fact, voted to double the size of the Department of Education with No Child Left Behind. So I'd call him a big government moderate, and so conservatives need to be very wary before thinking Santorum might be their champion.
This is Russ. Good morning, Russ.
Yes, Jan and the Senator Paul, it's good to talk to you this morning. One question I have for you, Senator Paul, is I wonder if you know if your father would be in favor of requiring the use of E-Verify by our nation's employers to screen out the illegal alien job seekers.
All right.
My father thinks that it is a primary duty of the federal government to secure the border, and we haven't been serious about it. One of the ways I think we could secure our border, I think you put about 10 helicopter stations along the border, and you have zero tolerance, have no one coming in illegally. Now, who should enforce it? Whose obligation it is? I think the federal government has a big obligation. He's often said that the troops we have overseas looking at the border between foreign countries should be home here looking at our border with Mexico. The federal government has a role. State governments have a role. State governments have to spend all the money on these illegal immigrants as they come in through free health care and free education. But with regard to whether businesses should be the policemen, he's not in favor of businesses being the policeman. He thinks the federal government's job is to control the border, and that it shouldn't be your obligation as a businessman, if you hire someone to cut your grass, that all of a sudden we're going to put you in jail if you hired the wrong person.
Your dad's from Texas, and the courts in Texas ordered your state to start educating the children of illegals based on the 14th Amendment. I think that's a scam. What do you think?
Well, the 14th Amendment says that, if you're born here, you're a citizen if you're under the jurisdiction of the United States. And this hasn't really been fully adjudicated in the Supreme Court. The liberals will tell you, everybody born here is automatically a citizen. I still think there is an open question. There's been one question before the Supreme Court, and it was the Ong Yank case.
The Wong case, and they wanted Chinese
but they were
children.
Naturalized, and they were here under a green card and had a child, and the court ruled that child was a citizen. But the courts never ruled that if the parents came here illegally and did not apply for any kind of green card, whether or not that child is still under the jurisdiction of Mexico. So I think I'd like to see that court case decided.
I don't want the courts to have anything to do with this because they'll screw it up, number one. And secondly, you don't have to have a court decision to refine what the original intent of the Senate was. When they wrote the 14th Amendment, it was Senator Jacob Howard And he said, just for the record, children under the jurisdiction thereof. And of course, this is a direct quote from the Senate record. Of course, this does not apply to the children of foreigners. So the original intent is it cannot be interpreted that way. Anyway, thank you for joining us, Rand.
Thank you.
Rand Paul, Senator from Kentucky, for Paul.
Views expressed are those of the host